Well, thanks for staying around for the question and answer portion. I'm happy to have Bernardo Ruiz here, the director, filmer, writer of the documentary, and we'll take questions from the audience. And I thought I'd start out asking one question, which is just to get us started, which is how did this film come about? It has an interesting story. You weren't necessarily thinking about this film when you got the idea.
Yeah, that's right. I actually, so I had no intention of making a film about journalism in Mexico or about this particular group of journalists. I was researching a film. I wanted to make a short film about a shelter for deported children. So the sequence where you see Sergio taking photographs of those teens who'd just been recently repatriated, I wanted to make a short film about that place. But when I started doing research, I started as early as 2006, but 2006, 2007, 2008, those years coincided with the rise in narco violence that we know that has grabbed headlines and has been a kind of sustained story out of Mexico. And so when I started spending time in Mexicali, in the border city that Sergio, the main character, is from, I really felt like I needed more of the story. And so I asked actually the director of the shelter, I asked her if she could introduce me to a journalist. And so I set up an appointment with Sergio, having never met him before, at a Starbucks in Mexicali on the Mexican side of the border. And I always tell this story, and it always embarrasses Sergio because he's a veteran crime reporter. But it was like a good first date. I mean, literally within 3 minutes, I was looking at him, I was listening to him speak, and I was thinking, there is a film in this man. And through him and through his newspaper, I can talk about a lot of the things that I'm interested in. So that was kind of the beginning of that whole process.
And how long did it take for you to put this project together?
So actual production was about 2 years. So it was 2 years of production. But after that meeting with Sergio, I went back and began raising money and began kind of initiating the process. And it was really my first completely independent feature-length documentary. I'd made other things before. I made some stuff for television. I did a commissioned biography of Roberto Clemente, the baseball player that was on American Experience. But this is the first thing where all of the errors would be mine and anything that worked would be mine. So it was the first independent thing that I did.
Are there some questions from the audience? I have a list of some things, but be happy to involve you in the conversation as well. I think there's a microphone at the middle for the aisle if you want.
I was just curious if you have a sense of where Zeta gets its funding. I know, practicing journalism in a lot of developing countries like Mexico and Latin America in general it's expensive, and because of pricing and the economy, it's often difficult just to be able to sustain a paper on just revenues from purchasing. I mean, like the same here in the States, right? But so I was just wondering if how they kind of make it.
So great question about SETA and how they, where they get their financing. So SETA really gets their financing from 3 different sources. One is sales. To this day, they continue to have a really robust print sales. If you go to Tijuana on a Friday morning and watch the newspaper vendors, I mean, the papers really sell like hotcakes. They do really, really well. So they have pretty robust sales even in the digital age. There's a kind of older and loyal readership that really likes print. So for the time being, print still matters in that part of Mexico. Advertising is another kind of strong source. SETA doesn't take government advertising, but they do take advertising from, for instance, the car armoring plant that you see in the film. They advertise in Seminario SETA so that they get revenue. And SETA is privately held. So Blanco Ornelas, when he created the paper, wanted it to be held by the family. So it's also held by the family. So it's their finances aren't precarious. They're a lean operation, but they're really able to kind of make money through sales, advertising, no grants, and no outside money. There's a very well-respected online publication in El Salvador, El Faro, which is the digital. They're more of the kind of ProPublica model where it's foundation grants and support, but SETA is run as a private business.
Has there been any backlash against any advertisers for supporting the newspaper?
Not in recent times. There is kind of a continued climate of threats against the paper for some of the organized crime stories. While we were filming, Adela Navarro, who's the co-editor of the paper, she received threats, which she withheld from us until a certain point in production. But there's a generalized climate, and the threats tend to come from a kind of pattern. It's usually when a story points fingers. Whenever there is a kind of a naming of names, people who are used to operating with impunity or anonymity, when they're named or when business transactions are called into question, brought into the light, those are the types of things that tend to provoke those kind of very, very harsh reactions.
And I believe I read something in one of the articles I looked at about someone in one of the editions in the 90s buying up all 30,000 copies. So there are some other ways that people who are unhappy with the press can intimidate. They can obviously commit violence against members of the press, but they can target advertisers. They could target the distribution system. And when we were watching, I noticed the trucks, big markings, SETA. Have there been issues with distribution? Has there been any other attempt, other than that one I mentioned, that you know of recently to sort of affect the distribution of it?
I mean, that's a really good it's a good point, because there are a number of different ways in which an independent news entity like SETA can be vulnerable. SETA is pretty established at this point. There are other independent outlets, regional outlets in Mexico, like Rio 12 in Sinaloa, which covers organized crime. You were talking about the state of Veracruz, which has seen some of the worst violence against journalists in Mexico. You brought up the case of Moises Sanchez, who was beheaded for his work. But SETA is actually a pretty established presence at this point. And SETA, because of its history, has had strong relationships with international organizations like Committee to Protect Journalists, like other international NGOs. So they have a greater confidence in the work that they do. It's not to say that they're not vulnerable. They're just not the kind of scrappy organization that they were at one point. And in some ways, they've been a model to these other news outlets like Rio 12. The kind of real crisis now is really around social media. There was a really horrific case. It was about a year and a half ago of a kind of a citizen blogger and Twitter user in Nuevo Laredo, the border city that's just south of Laredo. And she was reporting on the activities of organized crime, talking about roadblocks, saying to avoid certain areas. But she was beginning to call out kind of specific players in some of these activities, and her life was threatened, and eventually she was murdered, strung up from a bridge. So some of the things that we're talking about, in terms of journalism broadly, like electronic surveillance, is those tools are also available to actors in organized crime, and members in organized crime are using it to track down detractors or people who they feel like are being critical of them.
I see a hand in the back.
What has been the distribution of the film internationally and in Mexico, and has there been any reaction to it?
So the film was broadcast in the U.S. Through the public television series POV. It was nominated for an Emmy. And then in Mexico, it was distributed through Ambulante. And for those of you who don't know, Ambulante is this extraordinary itinerant documentary festival in Mexico, and it was started by the actors Diego Luna and Gael Garcia Bernal. And Reportero screened in 12 cities throughout Mexico. It also screened in Central America. It's screened all over, but it had a really kind of robust presence in Mexico. Kind of famous rocker in Mexico, rock musician named Saul Hernandez, really loved the film and promoted it heavily. Just the fact that he talked about the film meant that it equaled a kind of great uptick in press. So the film actually just screened about a month and a half ago in the Mexican Senate. There was an opposition senator who wanted to use it in conjunction with Ambulante as a way to talk about attacks on the press in Mexico. And so the theme, the kind of broader, not necessarily the specific story of SETA itself, but the broader theme of attacks on the press in Mexico continues to be unfortunately very relevant and very urgent. And so the film, because of that, I think has had a very strong life in Mexico.
Very good. In the back.
I'm interested more so in the process of making the film for you. So I know that usually the number of hours that people film are many, sometimes hundreds. So I'm interested in what the process was for you to choose the scenes that you put in the film, what you left out, and if there's anything that at this point you feel maybe could have given the film a different take, or you regret not putting a certain scene in, or stuff like that.
So I'm not a verite purist. I'm not someone who shoots hours and hours and hours. I really respect that tradition. It's just never the way I kind of learn to work, and it's not the way I think. I think of the kind of work that I do as being more interpretive, and that as I like to spend time with the participant in the film, with the subject matter, and then make choices based on that. It's constructed. It's not that what's happening in front of the frame is in any way constructed, but the choices are very clear about what's going to happen. So with the new film, for instance, I didn't have a crazy shooting ratio. It wasn't like 6 hours to every, 6 minutes for every 1 minute in the film. It was a pretty tight shooting ratio because I knew the types of scenes that I was going after. So for instance, I'll give you an example. In the new film that I just made, I have a scene where a human rights defender is talking to a woman whose daughter was likely disappeared by the Zetas, they believe, by the organized crime group, the Zetas. No relationship to the Zeta, the magazine in the film. And, I knew that they were planning to have a meeting. I knew it was going to happen in a certain way. So we shot it in we shut up on that moment and shot it in a very, very kind of specific way, in a very kind of static way, on a tripod, in a very kind of photographic way, not in a handheld, crazy way. When I have time to plan for something, I like to do it because I think that sometimes some of that verite work can be distracting. Also, I think that was something we talked about earlier today. I think audiences sometimes erroneously associate handheld work with truth, which I think is silly these days. In the era of reality television, that seems like a kind of silly thing. So I didn't really answer your question. I just rambled on. I'm sorry. So in this process, Reportero was really a learning experience, and I think that I was trying to pick scenes or situations that I knew would be compelling. For instance, filming the journalist in the car armoring place, I knew that had the potential to be compelling. Filming Sergio and his wife going to the place where his close friend was gunned down, I knew that those were going to yield things. At the same time, we have to stay open, as documentarians. So if something emerges, that's where we're different than any other kind of, than television certainly, or than other forms, is you have to be willing to be spontaneous. So it's that combination of, spontaneity and rigor that's interesting about documentary.
Thank you. I think that is the end of our time. But thank you for the great questions, and thank you for answering the questions, Bernardo. It's a pleasure to meet you, and thank everyone for coming out tonight. Have a good evening.
Thanks so much. It was a great introduction, by the way. I really appreciate it.